Hi, I'm Christopher Warnock of Renaissance Astrology, and today I'm going to talk about what I call the deep structure of astrological magic. But before I do that, I think we need to kind of back up and just kind of get a working definition of astrological magic. So the one I use is that astrological magic is a type of ceremonial magic, but you invoke only celestial spirits and all the ritual is timed astrologically. So obviously there's other ways to look at it. I mean, there's lots of ceremonial magic. You look at the Lesser Key of Solomon or Greater Key of Solomon. They're not working with astrological spirits, but they are using basic astrological techniques like planetary hour or moon phases or moon signs for timing. You could argue this is astrological magic. I would say it's more astrological timing, but again, that's another way to look at it. There's also currently a sort of a movement to ditch astrological timing and to do invocation of celestial spirits at any time the magician wants. That's sort of popular with magicians. I think partly because they don't know astrology, don't want to learn astrology, or I think a lot of the magic sort of mindset is that you kind of it's will. There's an I-ness about it, and so I want to do it now, and I don't want to wait around for 3 months till the this window opens up. Again, that this is that's invoking astrological spirits but not timing it. I mean, my opinion on that would be it seems like you're losing a significant amount of the power there if you're not timing it appropriately. I mean, those are times when those uh, planets or fixed stars or whatever are really strong. Um, and so that seems like that would make sense. Other people say no, you can just do it anytime you want and just do a big ritual. So again, these are other approaches to it. Um, so obviously I like my definition, and if I didn't like it, it wouldn't be my definition. Um, I'll say in defense of it that this basically corresponds to what we find in traditional practice in Picatrix, the three books of occult philosophy. Um, when they're doing astrological magic, they're only invoking astrological spirits, and they're insisting on the necessity of astrological timing for any kind of ritual or creation of talismans. So there's that going forward, I think. I don't. Again, I said there's not really point in arguing about it. I think in those situations, I tend to get shouted out on social media or whatever. So, it's almost in a defense mechanism to say, look, this can be multiple views, but I actually do believe it. I think that there's other ways to approach it. It really comes down to more of a preferential thing. But I thought I would lay out, my, focus and what I think about it. But I think it's useful in terms of, as certainly for this discussion, and if you're looking at any of my other stuff, this is what astrological magic is, as far as I'm concerned, when I refer to it. Like I said, I'm referring to a type of ceremonial magic that only invokes astrological spirits and does so with appropriate astrological timing. And generally, what I'm going to be focusing on is a full chart election, not just picking one or two, like I said, like moon phase or something, but actually doing a full chart election with multiple factors. Um, so I think another issue that we really need to deal with is the causality, because even if we kind of are in the same framework in terms of what we're doing, the astrological magic is what's going on, how does it actually work, and this is something that a lot of modern practitioners or whatever don't really think about too much, I don't think. um, and I think a lot of it comes down to, again, to worldview. I mean, I talk a lot about worldview. It's very important in my courses. I start off with it, but I do think it's very key, and it's the foundation for everything else we're doing. It's the foundation for philosophy and our practice and everything like that. So a worldview is basically our unconscious view, our unconscious view of how things work, what reality consists of. And the modern worldview is basically atheistic materialism, which is to say that nothing really exists except matter and energy, and they're equal to each other, equal MC squared. That spirituality is just psychology, and psychology is really just brain function. And the brain sort of excretes thought like the gallbladder excretes gall. These are all physical, can be reduced to physical functions. Um, and so that's a little bit odd to have as a conscious worldview if you're doing magic, but it's pretty much the water that we swim in. And so that's going to be very strongly influencing people unless you spend a lot of time working on it and working through it and and moving. It is possible, again, to have different worldviews. And certainly the modern worldview is very different from every other society. Every other society has always felt that the spiritual was primary, that it was the most real, and that everything material really depended on the spiritual. But a good example of this is that you get this sort of it's an unconscious atheistic materialism in terms of what the causality is. So the tendency is to think in terms of energy or beams. So it's again a very material or energetic explanation. And a chart remediation, I think, is a good example of this. I think most people, when they're looking at it, they're thinking, okay, Saturn is transiting, and so therefore what's happening is that I'm being attacked by some sort of beams or something, and I need a shield, I need something to protect me from these beams, this negative energy that's being shot at me, and that's what the problem is. And I can look at the chart, and I can see, Saturn there, and therefore I know that's what the problem is. Part of the problem with this as a theory is that they're forgetting that a transit is when the planet's current position has a relationship to your natal chart. So that's just a ratio, really. In fact, it's just a relationship. The Saturn is not in a physical position to be, let's say, beaming rays at you during a transit any more than it is any other time. So that's a symbolic, not symbolic in the sense of it's not really happening, but that's a deeper causality if that's indicating something, which I think transits they certainly have some predictive effect and are useful for that. But in terms of them actually being some kind of beam or something, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Which is not to say that the beam sort of view isn't part of traditional astrology or traditional causality. The Arabic medieval astrologer Al-Kindi has a book called On the Stellar Rays. His view is that everything puts off these rays, but these are spiritual. They're not X-rays or magnetism or something that can be scientifically detected. But even that doesn't make a whole lot of sense in terms of, like I said, transits or, say, horary. I mean, you can sort of see with the natal chart where you're born and you're physically hit by the beams coming from a certain angle or something or whatever. But horary is very odd because it's the time of the question, and the time of the question chart gives you the answer. That doesn't make any sense from any kind of, energetic or material causality. What that's pointing to is this idea, and this is what we step to for another sort of strand in explanations of how astrology and work, as like Plotinus is a good example of it. And what he's saying is that the stars, he has an Aeneid called All the Stars Cause Us, and he says no. He says the stars are not directly causing things. What's happening is that the entire cosmos is one great unified being, and then all the parts reflect each other. So, for example, if you had yellow skin, then you could say the person has a symptom of jaundice, et cetera, et cetera. So that the stars, he says, are these characters written in the heavens, and if you read the stars, you can understand what's happening on the other. They're reflecting the cycles in the heavens reflect these other spiritual cycles. So that's, we could sort of understand horary from that standpoint. You could say, okay, this is the spiritual cycles of the heavens, again, are reflecting the spiritual cycles on Earth. They fit together. The emotional punch of asking the question aligns you then with these, with the heavens, and therefore that's why you get the answer. That makes more sense than there's some kind of beams, and that's why they made you ask the question. I mean, I suppose it's possible, but that doesn't seem as logical to me. Again, it's everyone's preference for this. Another possibility, another sort of way of looking at these, and again, to look at these as completely, you have to buy into one, and you have to then argue against everybody else, and one has to be completely an explanation. As I was thinking about this video, I had a flash about this third idea, which is this idea that you're talking about spiritual beings. So that this is a magical approach, so that the celestial spirits can be interacted with as personalities. As I said, I kind of had a flash that this is an interface. On Star Trek, they'll sometimes say, well, we're appearing in a form that you're comfortable with. I mean, this is a way to relate to this. We spend a lot of time talking to people and relating to people, so that's a way for us to relate to these spiritual entities. And again, I think that probably if we look at these, this is modeling. And it's that whole, there's in various traditions story about these, blind men that went to see an elephant, and one touched the trunk and said, oh, it's like a snake, and the other touched the leg and said, oh, it's like a pillar, and the other touched the side and said, it's like a wall. I mean, I think these are, and we're thinking about the beams, the spiritual cosmos is one great being, and the personalities are all reflecting different aspects of reality. The reality is multifaceted. So they're also, they're just models and they're modeling. So they're useful for certain interactions and they're not so useful for other ones. So again, the causality really is important because our theory of causality, our view of how the causality works, really does determine our practical use of things. And you can definitely see that with, with talismans. So, talismans, astrological talismans are going to pick a particular celestial factor. You pick a time that's appropriate for that, and then you invoke the spirit or the angel of that factor, like the sun, for example, and you then create a talisman that's, you could say it's imbued with their energy. So, that's one way of looking at it, is thinking, okay, this is energy, so the talisman's like a battery, and we're charging with some kind of energy, and it's going to lose its charge over a while, and we need the actual physical talisman is the focus. You need to, that's where the energy is focused. That's where the energy is coming from. It's putting off some kind of beams. So you should carry it because the beams, I guess, are radiating from it. I've seen stuff that says, oh, you have to wear it next to your skin. People are often asking me, oh, do I have to wear it 24 hours? I mean, that's another thing too. So this is all really makes a lot of sense if you're thinking of it as a battery. So then also, if it's a battery, when you're done with it, you can just toss it out, give it away. It's no problem. It's impersonal. It's just a thing. And when you get what you want with it, you just get what you need and then toss it. It's just a thing. And again, I wouldn't go so far as to say this is wrong. There's certainly, as I said, Al-Kindi, there's spiritual antecedents for this sort of battery idea, but you can also see how heavily influenced that is by an atheistic materialistic model, particularly unconsciously. I mean, it makes sense, but that's because it makes sense because people are thinking in an atheistic materialistic mode. So another possibility, and this is what, I was talking about the spiritual beings, and this is my preference, but again, it's this is just what resonates with me, is that the talisman is a point of contact with a celestial spirit. So it's a bit like having their cell phone number, or like a portal into their sphere, a door, window, so to speak. It's very focused and intense because of the time of the making was done so carefully, and also the idea that it's become a living being, that you're ensouling the talisman, so to speak. With the timing and consecration. So what it is essentially is an opportunity for you. And so you need to go with a talisman, in my view, and do more with it than just have it. You need to consecrate it. And what that consecration is essentially getting in contact with the spirit. And then if you do it regularly, they're going to have a relationship, and you want to have a positive relationship. And that sort of dovetails with my approach, which is I consider to be devotional. I'm moving more and more towards being sort of a celestial priest, as opposed to an astrological magician, and you could say that the difference there is that the devotional approach is to respect and focus on the relationship more than it is on the specific effects, which would be considered to be more magical. And again, they blend together. I mean, obviously, the magical approach has a devotional side to it, and the devotional also is, you certainly can get effects from having a devotional practice, even if that's not the major focus. So understanding this sort of the worldview, the philosophy, the causality, that sort of brings us to when I originally was saying that the focus of this talk was about. We kind of had to do a lot of background to get here, but this whole idea of deep structure. So this causality is a fairly deep framework of it. How does it actually work? But then once we have a sense of how it works, then we want to think about methodology. Now, this is a little bit odd because, again, as I look around and look at people doing electional astrology, which is using, astrological techniques to pick times to do things that are auspicious for things. Like, for example, if you want to get married, you pick a time that's good for marriage, whatever. And certainly astrological magic electional astrology is very important because what you're trying to do is pick an appropriate time to make that talisman or do that astrological consecration or invocation or whatever you're doing. But when I look around at the modern electional method, it seems to almost reject conscious methodology, but it certainly has an unconscious way of going about things. Now, this methodology is very free-form. It really seems to me that a lot of people are doing is essentially they're just starting to look at charts randomly. And what they do is to see what comes up, and what jumps out at them in the chart. It's sort of very intuitive, so to speak. And what they've got is a whole bunch of possible negative and possible positive factors that might jump out at them in a chart. The other thing is that the modern approach is very natally based. I mean, modern astrology is predominantly natal astrology. That's what everyone starts with. People are often very, very interested in their own chart and other people's charts. And so anything they want to do, they're going to use a natal chart for that. So again, with the talismanic magic, I've had people contact me and say, what do I do with my natal chart? And it's like, well, really we're going to focus on using the, creation a time in the election that's appropriate for whatever celestial factor we work with. And we really wouldn't be dealing with your natal chart, which kind of throws people because their assumption is that, well, if it's astrology, it's got to be natal. That's the only possible way of astrology. But that's actually that's again very conditioned by the modern approach. And again, you see that with the people trying to do what I would term synastry. So they'll get the talisman chart and they'll want to then compare that to their natal chart, and which very much analogizes to like if you synastry where you're talking about a marriage and you look at the two partners and see how they relate to each other. The conceptual problem for me with this is that, I mean, again, it's a preference thing, but the problem with the talisman is it doesn't really relate to the chart the way a human being does. And a talisman does not have, for example, it doesn't have neighbors, it doesn't have a home, it doesn't have children, it doesn't have illnesses, it doesn't have a romantic partner, it doesn't have spiritual teachers of the talisman, it doesn't have a career. All the house assignments are basically for humans, and they're not going to fit very well for a talisman. So then to be combining all these pieces of the chart and looking at them all as being relevant doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And again, if you're coming out of a horary approach, you only look at limited parts of the chart, and that's much more, horary is sort of the sister of electional. So again, different perspective, different approach. The other thing that I notice that people do is there's a tendency to have a few factors that they really like. I mean, they'll be looking at, like, if there's a retrograde Mercury, they don't want to do anything. Or if void of course moon, that means every single thing is, problematic for that. Or the factors will be sort of random. I had somebody who was interested in an algal talisman, and again, like I said, they did the synastry, and they said, well, my husband and my charts combined, and I wasn't, it's a modern technique, I wasn't sure about it. So they're sort of combined charts. Then the midpoint of those was sextile algal, which seemed to me to be extremely random. A lot of times the factors people are coming up with is that pretty much any chart, two charts, you can find some way they relate to each other. But whether that's meaningful or whether you can do any kind of prediction with it is questionable in a negative or positive way. So the problem is that, again, there is a methodology here, but it is very random. And so you're going to have a wide variety of differences in terms of, like, I mean, again, if someone's focusing on, okay, I don't want any retrograde Mercury, then they won't have that in the chart. But otherwise, the times that are chosen are going to really vary. There's really not a methodology for choosing those times if that's the style that you're using. So one of the things that I think that I focused on, and this is sort of was just natural to me, maybe because of my, somewhat academic or legal background or whatever, is wanting to be very methodical about what I was doing, to be very logical about it, in terms of just having factors that I'm looking at. Not logical in the sense of good, but logic in the sense of following a methodology and working with that. And so, as I was looking at this is 20 years ago when I first started looking at astrological magic, and I think it's also interesting too because the methodology that I've developed basically is what everybody else uses. And pretty much, I was looking the other day at somebody, was advertising, what is a Venus talisman or something like that. And so they followed, again, very closely what I'm going to describe here, which is, first of all, to look at our traditional sources and to say, very clearly, this is a practical methodology that they're laying out for making talismans. The problem with the traditional sources is they're only giving the skeleton. They're not really going through and giving you the specifics of it. And what they'll typically do in a traditional source for electional is they'll say 50 factors. I mean, they'll summarize every single factor, 10 different sources and, 6 factors each. And there's no way you're going to be able to find 60 factors in the election. You have to make some kind of choice. So what I did was to say, let's look at traditional sources and let's, for example, Agrippa, 3 books of occult philosophy, Picatrix, Thabit, and Mankura, And let's actually cite to those sources. So again, if you look at one of my talismans, you can see the source, and you can actually go to the page number in that source and take a look and say, okay, well, let's take a look at this. It's not like I completely made it up, but rather, this is actually based on these traditional sources. Then what these sources do is they actually give specific factors. For example, for a sun talisman, like Book 2, Chapter 10, I think, is one of the classic ones. It gives a lot of images, and then they typically are based on having the planet rising, and then having the being in the planetary hour, and then usually being in the exaltation or sign of the planet. And that's kind of one of the common factors in that. They vary a lot. And so what I did is say, let's look at what the traditional source says. Let's look at the factors that they list there, and then let's go actually find a chart that has those factors in it. Now that seems very obvious and basic, but before I stepped in and did this, nobody was making astrological talismans publicly, and there really wasn't a methodology for doing it. And like I said, if I look at the stuff that people are doing now, it's very similar. Like I said, the other day someone was doing a Venus talisman. It was like, okay, here's Picatrix, here's the page, here's the factors, here's the chart, here's the ritual I did out of Picatrix. So, again, that seems very obvious, but somebody had to go and lay that out, and that's again what I did 20 years ago, and I've been doing for the past 20 years with this. That framework I think is very useful because it gives you a very empirical way of looking at that chart. So you can see that there's specific factors that must be in the chart, and usually I'm electing, for example, let's just talk about planetary talismans. The classic recipe, and again, this is derived from Picatrix, and in that Book 2, Chapter 10, for the most part. If you look through those, they vary, but there's commonality in terms of we can kind of look through the actual factors and look at the essence, because the traditional stuff can be a little disorganized, and they don't often explain themselves, and they also can be contradictory. So if we look at an essential sort of factors and this is, again, they're not the only way to do it, but this is what I've distilled from this part of Picatrix and use as a methodology. So again, you want to have, for example, the sun talisman, you want to have the sun in Aries or Leo, so an exaltation or sign. You want to have the planet either rising or culminating, because those are the two strongest positions in terms of accidental dignity. And then you want to have the planetary hour of that planet, because again, it's strong at that planetary hour. And then you also want to have the planet unafflicted. And I also added having the moon unafflicted. Okay. Now, what afflicted is, there's all sorts of ways you could do that. You could do, and I'll talk a little about that later. But that's the real structure there. Those sort of four factors. So you must have those rising, culminating, dignity, and then planetary hour, and you can't have affliction. A major affliction. Minor affliction we're not going to worry about, but major affliction, you can't have a major affliction. So those are standard that I use for every election of that type. Every time I do it, it has those factors in it, or they're left out. And you can count on that and look at those, and you can see it, how it's reflected from the source, and then also you can see it in the chart of that specific talisman. And then you actually make the talisman. That's another thing too. Again, 20 years ago when I was doing this, nobody actually did these. So this was, that was a real breakthrough. The traditional astrologers who could do it were not interested in making talismans. They didn't want to touch it. So kind of breaking that barrier. And I just remember that there was a lot of with astrologers, modern astrologers, they weren't happy about it, because they're like, sort of like, you're giving us a bad name. You're doing, we're trying to be respectable, and here you're doing magic. What's wonderful now is that astrological magic has really taken off, and it's grown beyond, when I was the only one, it's now, there's many, many people doing it, which is really wonderful. I'm really happy about that. I was a little lonely being the only astrological magician. But I do think it's important to explain sort of the contribution that I made. I started the ball rolling, so to speak, on the astrological magic revival. And the way I did that was, as I said, translating Picatrix is fairly obvious, but setting off this methodology I think is good. And also just as a bedrock idea that there ought to be a conscious methodology, that we ought to be doing this in a very conscious, logical, empirical way, as opposed to doing it unconsciously, as opposed to just randomly looking at charts and seeing what sort of pops out at us, which is, again, a very kind of hit or miss process. We've actually got these specific factors. Now what's grown up is there's different views, even on people using this basic methodology, about how you structure it. And I guess, I would loosely characterize that as what I call the OCD school and the laissez-faire school, sort of humorously. So I'm in the laissez-faire school. I don't have as many factors. I mean, I'm strict about the factors that I have, but I only still try to elect for, say, 4 or 5 factors, because if you do more than that, you're going to go nuts. You're going to drive yourself crazy trying to find an election that fits that, and you're not going to be able to make the talismans. Whereas if you make the talismans with the factors I use, yet there's some other factor in there that's negative or positive, you're still going to have a powerful talisman. And I can see this because I've got 80 pages of testimonials of people saying, yeah, these talismans are great. They worked well for me. But again, it's a personal choice. And the other school, like what I call the OCD school, they have many, many, many more factors that they're looking at. And they're a lot more concerned about if there's one negative factor in that chart, then you're going to be dead. You're going to be, your head's going to explode. It's exaggerating a certain amount, but they're just a lot more worried about these factors. And so essentially what they end up with is a situation where they're not able to make the talisman for a long time. They have to wait. Now, here's the thing. If you're worried about negative factors, you can never entirely eliminate negative factors. It's impossible to do an election that's perfect. Every single election has something wrong with it. And so the difference between the OCD school and the laissez-faire school is basically your tolerance for negative factors. Because even with the OCD school, it's impossible to have an election with no negative factors whatsoever. So they have to make a decision as far as which ones they're going to tolerate. They just tolerate less than I do. So it's, again, very clear it's a preference thing. So someone who comes on and says, that's a dangerous election, and freaks people out about it, is just saying, look, I like chocolate versus vanilla. Because really, there has to be this scale of, everything. You can't have everything positive, and you can't eliminate everything negative. It's absolutely impossible. So if you actually make talismans, there needs to be some sort of practical compromise in terms of deciding where that level is. Now, where you set that level, everyone has a different opinion about it. So again, I would not want to come and say, oh, I'm right and everybody else is wrong, because clearly there's just, it's a level of preference there. So I think that the key too for me is to look at the sources and say, what's the essence here? What are they trying to accomplish? And you'll see these, essentially, like I said, a sun talisman, and they'll be like, okay, but don't have Jupiter cadent. I'm like, why is that really relevant to a sun talisman? And I mean, if you can follow it, great. But if you've got 10 factors and you're essentially trying to focus on increasing the sun energy, why Jupiter, why that's even relevant, it's not even clear. So I have a tendency to leave those out if they get in the way of impeding that. If the essence of the election is, because that's the other problem too, is that you can be too loosey-goosey about it, or you can be so overly strict and saying you have to follow it exactly, and that, again, that becomes impossible to find the election or do it. And there's not a logic behind it other than that's what the book says, and we just have to follow whatever it says, even if it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, or it goes against, it's contradictory. So again, my approach is really to try to maximize the positive factors, to minimize the negative, and to be as practical as possible to actually be able to find and use elections for talismans. So I think that's the essence, what I would say of the laissez-faire school, is to say we want to make talismans, and we're going to be practical about it insofar as we're not going to have 50 factors. I think ultimately, as I was saying, what I think is very useful here is, rather than fighting about what's the best methodology, I think it's much more useful to say, okay, what is your methodology, and to be conscious of it, and to be doing that in a conscious way as opposed to unconsciously. And particularly when it's influenced by an atheistic materialistic worldview, or by a modern astrology approach that's very natal. And so you're kind of just sleepwalking through this stuff as opposed to being aware of what you're doing. If you're aware of it, great. But again, to be unconscious of it and be controlled by that and be like, oh, that makes a lot of sense to me without even understanding why that's true, I think that's a little bit problematic. And I think the most important thing is to actually have a methodology and be consistent about using that methodology. And that way, when you can, in terms of getting effects or whatever, you've got some consistency and a sense of what what's working for you and what resonates for you. So I think it's useful. Happy to talk about this. It's, I think it's important to understand that. I also think it's useful to understand my role in the Astrological Magic Revival. Like I said, even though I sort of started things out, I'm incredibly happy that there's so many people doing it now and so many different approaches. And despite the fact that, of course, I like my way, it's definitely not the only way. And it's wonderful to have so many options and so many things to do here. So to me, the greatest thing is to have been a link in the golden chain, a hermetic chain of transmission. You had this fossilized practice that's been reborn. It's now this incredible expanding community. And I think it's just great to think about these ideas and to do it in a thoughtful and conscious way as opposed to be unconscious. So again, if you're interested in this, obviously, you can take courses from me, but you can also just get a sense of when you're looking at talismans or trying to understand my approach as to why I do things. I think I've thought about it a lot, and obviously I think that's a good approach. So again, great talking to you today, and I hope you have a lot of excitement and enjoyment diving into astrological magic.